For some architectural theorists, discussing the relationship between power, politics, and architecture can seem risky. Denise Costanzo, for example, decides to not take a position in the 9th chapter of her textbook, What Architecture Means. She vacillates between framing architects as pawns stuck to the Leviathan-like web of political and economic elites in the first half, while in the second they emerge as agents capable of resisting such domination. While this all-encompassing review approach is coherent for a textbook, her divergent eclecticism can be questioned. Are we facing even-handedness or evasion? What about the urgency of the issues that lie between architecture and politics? Their services are only scratched by Costanzo's writing, and her analysis would be strengthened by more explicit engagement with politically committed architectural discourse. In the first half of Chapter 9, Costanzo frames the relation between politics and architecture with a clear hierarchy. Architects are following the government's interests, which are the economic and political elites' interests. Architects have no agency to break through the dominant forces. In fact, they act in favor of this web. We can take as an example her mention of the demolition of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow and the design competition Stalin organized to build a new monument glorifying socialism, the Palace of the Soviets. Dozens of architects entered this competition and endeavored to design a building around the government's questionable interests and objective, with no room for the architect's personal ideals or sense of responsibility for the good of the general public. In the second half of Chapter 9, Costanzo shifts focus to frame architects as promising individuals full of agency to reach above constraining political, economical elites and overcome racial and sexist stereotypes. One example from the text is Paul Revere Williams, the first registered African-American architect west of the Mississippi in 1921. Costanzo states, Williams devised many strategies to succeed in a majority white environment. He entered mail-order design competitions where his work would be judged without knowledge of his race. Williams even learned to draw upside down so he could sit opposite, not next to, prospective white clients. Over time, his talent, professionalism, and remarkable sensitivity to clients' biases allowed him to succeed within a racist culture. The fact that Williams was able to overcome the societal norms of the time and even used his architectural prowess in order to heighten his position in society states that architects have the power to go against the grain regarding government practices and social benchmarks. However, the chapter structure produces symmetry between constraint and agency, but that symmetry can function as a moral neutralizer. It evens out responsibility. Costanzo does bring political references to her writing, but tones them down by rephrasing charged statements in neutral, descriptive terms. For example, Johnson originally wrote that architects must say yes to someone if we want to stay in business, in the situation of designing a monument for an authoritative state. Costanzo reduces his position to him caring little about what forms of power his work celebrated. Similarly, when discussing Eisenman, she barely touches his radical claims on architecture and late capitalism postmodern alienation, such as, I don't design houses with the nuclear family idea because I don't believe in it as a concept, and decided to close the paragraph with, all architects can do is accept and explore architecture's instability through endless debate, knowing that this process will not produce truth, just ever greater fragmentation of meaning. Through such rhetorical moves, Costanzo distances herself from political and ethical stakes, presenting theory as a detached debate rather than contested ground. Costanzo's eclecticism tries to be fair and plural. However, fairness that flattens asymmetry is not neutral, it's complicit. It is time scholarship names injustice to oppose it. Costanzo would make a stronger argument had she followed the advice political scientist Chantal Mouffe gives in her book On the Political. Mouffe would contend that the neutrality Costanzo aims for is an illusion, and a politically dangerous one. To write objectively about social harms is to depoliticize them, and depoliticization, in her view, is a strategy that can only benefit maintenance of domination. A Mouffian response would say that scholars have a responsibility to articulate the economic forces at play in producing social harms, to highlight the competing projects and exclusions that structure them, and to accept that their own theoretical position is necessarily partisan. In fact, Costanzo's choice not to take a position is itself a move filled with risky consequences. While What Architecture Means is only a textbook and definitely not a manifesto, her lack of political engagement can affect what students take with them after reading. In better words, students who read her textbook are not carrying with them critical baggage to question disregards and shortcomings present in architectural practice and theory. I'll give you an example. On page 230, Costanzo observes that when architects cooperate closely with power structures, they often gain great professional opportunities. While this statement is certainly accurate, she does not push further into the ethical and political terrain it opens. The passage could have interrogated what such cooperation entails for those outside the profession, the citizens who live with the consequences of designs produced in service of domination, or those marginalized when architectural practice aligns with oppressive governments. Instead, the discussion pivots towards a historical account of German intellectuals in the post-Nazi period, leaving unexamined the ethical stakes of architectural complicity. The result is that students may walk away with an expanded arsenal of historical facts, but without a sharpened awareness of how an architect's choices can either reinforce or resist the suffering of oppressed communities. Which lesson is more urgent, to catalog history or to cultivate political consciousness about architecture's entanglement with power? We can rewrite a Costanzo passage by replacing neutral wording with explicit, politically engaged language. When architects cooperate closely with power structures, they often gain great professional opportunities, but also active participation in legitimizing regimes built around exclusion and violence. She continues, many intellectuals who remained in Nazi Germany have since been judged complicit in the events that followed. Here, judge complicit frames their complicity as a mere opinion subject to be easily disregarded or forgotten. It would also be beneficial to restore the political weight in her writing. Costanzo frames the architect as a flexible figure, a leader's deputy, a public advocate, or a bridge between power and the people. But her neutral phrasing abstracts away conflict. By contrast, restoring political weight means naming actors and harms. Deputies legitimize authoritarian leaders, laborers face exploitation, and communities endure displacement when monuments entrench inequality. Relocating authority from elites to publics and proposing alternatives like participatory design highlights architecture not as a passive reflection of a matrix, but as a field where power is contested and justice can be pursued. In conclusion, neutrality is not an absence of politics. It is itself a political stance. If architectural criticism refuses to take sides, it becomes part of the machinery that makes some lives expendable. When architecture claims neutrality, its silence is not impartial. It is a choice that determines who is visible and therefore who can be free of harm caused by political architecture issues. The real question is not whether architecture can resist unequal power, it is whether scholarship will have the ethics and courage to make a socially committed statement.